Good morning. Come on, energy, energy. Good morning. All right, if I came all the way from the west coast of the U.S. and dealing with jet lag, and I have energy, you guys have to have energy too. So a huge thanks to KKL, David, Yahel, Johannes, Chanuk, and everyone else who's helped make this a reality. It really is the culmination of several years of conversations, and we see this truly as a beginning. The Forest Service and Cacao has had a long-term relationship, as Brian mentioned, and WRI is really excited to be part of this partnership and hopefully building to something even more exciting moving forward. And as Brian mentioned, I get to travel the world. It's a wonderful job and incredible opportunity that I have. And when I tell my grandmother that I'm going to Rwanda or Brazil or India, she always gives me lectures about, being safe and making sure that I'm thoughtful of where I am. And when I told her I was going to Israel, she said, maybe you'll find a nice Jewish woman to bring home. So that is sort of, I guess, one of my goals for this trip, in addition to hopefully kind of coming up with a common understanding of ecosystem services and really, what it means. And I'm not kidding, So, with that, there's sort of three main goals for the day. The first is to make sure that we do all have a common understanding of what the concept of ecosystem services is all about. And we're going to do that through a number of dialogues and presentations that primarily focus on how other places around the globe are thinking about ecosystem services. How they're determining the current conditions, how they're visioning what they want these systems to look like moving forward, and what they're doing on the ground and how that relates to policy and management decisions that truly incorporates the framework of ecosystem services, both for ecological gain, but also for social welfare as well, economically and for society and communities. So that's sort of the first core element of the agenda today. The second, and equally important, is to get a better understanding of what is currently going on within Cacao and the other natural resource agencies within Israel in terms of ecosystem services, with the development of the management plan and other related efforts. Where do things currently stand? How do we think about taking this concept and broadening it even beyond Cacao so that everyone is thinking about this approach and determining if it's appropriate for their management objectives? And then the third piece is really what's next. How do we take this information and think about how we move it from a conversation and planning concept to really something that we might implement on the ground? Where might we pilot these ideas? How do we think about adaptive management? And does this make sense in the Israeli concept for future years moving forward? So with that, let me begin my presentation, please. Doesn't seem to work. Yeah, I can use this. So this is my third time in Israel, and each time it's a totally new experience, but also a benchmark for me to kind of look at where I am in my life relative to where I was in my previous engagements in Israel. And the first time I was here was in 1998, and I was a strapping young 19-year-old at university, and I was here on the birthright trip. And it was one of the most incredible experiences that I had had at that point in my life. There were about 20 of us from the East Coast of the US, almost all of us. It was our first experience here, and we got to travel the country and really make that deep connection, outside of Hebrew school, what it meant to be in Israel and how that tied to our lives. And that idea of cultural connection and the aesthetics and the beauty of Israel was really my first engagement in the ecosystem services of the region, at least me physically being here. But even before that, my family spent time in Israel. And so I am part of the tree planting campaign in Cacao. This is my parents in, I believe, the early 90s, planting a tree for my sister and I, and have the documentation to prove it. So if the forests are overstocked, if there's too many trees per hectare, it's partly my fault too. So I do take some responsibility for that reality. But really, so many people who come to Israel, it is the ecosystem services. Maybe they start off with the cultural and religious elements, but from there, they're able to engage in the beauty, the biodiversity, and all else that this amazing country has to offer. So over the next kind of 20 minutes, really using this presentation to set the stage for the rest of the day, and hopefully for a continuing dialogue that goes on for years to come. And really focus early on making sure we're all on the same page with the concept and the framing, move on to some global case studies and how they think about ecosystem services, how that is resonated into planning and management and practice, and then try to synthesize some of the key takeaways, which I think will be important for the rest of the day ahead. So with that, in 2004, the Millennium Ecosystem Service Assessment was developed. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. Scientists and practitioners from across the globe came together to do two things. One, to really try to get a handle on the current state and trends around ecosystem services, make some projections moving forward, and really set up a baseline to then track how the world was doing in terms of managing the resources that make our economy and our society thrive. And for a majority of the 20th century, when we thought about ecosystem services and the way we managed, it was mostly on the provisioning side of ecosystem services. Timber, fisheries, minerals out of the ground, etc. And those were critical, and that helped us as a society grow and prosper to where we are today. But over the last 20 years, there's been a clear recognition that if we just focus on the provisioning part, the provisioning services won't be there forever. We've got to be thinking about the other elements as well and how we balance the management, not just for the hard, tangible goods, but for the other components as well, such as climate regulation, watershed services, and the like. And then again, what makes Israel so special, and many people outside of Israel's first experience here, is that cultural and aesthetic element, sort of a connection to place. And like any management decision, you cannot maximize all three themes at once. There are inherent trade-offs, economically, ecologically, and socially. And bringing the right people to the table and thinking about those trade-offs is pretty critical. So what I want to do is just quickly run through a couple of slides, and I don't expect you to read everything on the screen. I will make these slides available to you if you so desire, but just give you some highlights of the trends across regions of the world and across ecosystem services. And the common theme is red is generally bad, and other colors are slightly better. And unfortunately, you're going to see more red than you are with other colors. So these are the services that over the last 20 or so years have been recognized as being degraded. So their provisioning and the ability of what they provide has gone down. Some of the more kind of tangible services have been a mixed bag depending on where you are. In some places they've increased, in other places they've decreased. And a few others have actually been enhanced. But again, where they've been enhanced, sometimes there's been unintended consequences and trade-offs. But carbon sequestration is one thing that you're seeing with Paris agreements in late 2015, hopefully will be a major step forward in terms of how we think about and manage these critical services. From a regional standpoint, I've sort of broken the globe into about a half dozen different categories. And at the top there are some of the core kind of ecosystem services, and if things are getting better and worse. And again, don't worry about trying to capture all of these, just take an overall kind of thematic look of where things are headed. So from the forest system, unfortunately, a majority of these are not headed in the right direction. Primarily the Israeli context would fall in some of these categories, and again, with water stress and increasing populations in urban centers, we're seeing a lot of challenges. in more wet areas, whether it's inland river systems, coastal, deep sea, again, with overexploitation of fisheries, with storm surges, we're seeing a lot of challenges that we need to be considering. And then finally, in some of the more remote areas, either in the Arctic or island systems, where there's very little margin, right? A change in climate, a change in development patterns can have consequences which may be difficult to come back from. And that's the core thing with the ecosystem services. There are thresholds. And some of those thresholds, once you pass, it's very difficult to reverse that cycle. And it's critical to understand where we are, what that vision for the future looks like, and how we move forward in a sustainable way. So this diagram is this happens to be a farm out in Oregon, not far from where Nicola and I live, but this could easily be one of the forest areas outside of Jerusalem or the northern Negev or near Haifa. And when you look at a plot of land, you've got to decide which services you want to accentuate and prioritize, and which services you're going to downplay a little bit, and think through the why and the how. But there's lots of different options for how you would manage a piece of land. So there's timber management and food production. There's dealing with water quality, whether it's surface water and rain capture or groundwater recharge. Cultural values, religious values, aesthetics, which is obviously such a critical element here in Israel, balancing the history with some of the needs to be progressive and thoughtful moving forward. Recreation, I know that's a huge priority of Kakao, especially mountain biking and hiking, by also keeping it sustainable with crowds. Flood control, species and biodiversity, again, all of these things, how do you balance them? Carbon sequestration, which is in many ways the envelope of what all other ecosystem services operate within. If there's changes in climate, that dramatically impacts the way you need to be thinking about and managing your landscape. Oops. And again, with everything there are trade-offs. We've seen huge enhancements in food security in many parts of the world, but that has meant more hectares dedicated to agriculture as opposed to forest systems, which in many places has had major impacts on water quality, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution, and the like. And for many people, that's a fine and fair trade-off. For others, it's something that may not be an ideal outcome. And this is not, people often ask, ecosystem services, isn't it just a fancy set of words for what we're already doing? And in some cases, the answer is yes. In other cases, the answer is no. It is a intentional capturing of a current system and transparency around the goals and the vision, and a stakeholder-driven process to understand how we get from where we currently are to where we want to go. But in no way is it a substitute for biodiversity plans, for fire management plans. Those all need to be subcomponents of an ecosystem services approach. And really, it's at that intersection of ecology and human needs. And there's no right or wrong answer. There just needs to be a lot of thought and clarity and adaptive management. Because whatever we decide here in 2016, the world's going to look different politically, from a security standpoint, both water and more true security in a couple of years. So this is a long-term iterative process we need to keep revisiting. So with that, I want to kind of run through a handful of examples of how we pull this from what frankly is a theoretical idea into ways that other regions around the globe have dealt with this issue. And what I've tried to do is pick different sectors of the economy and how they've thought about the concept of ecosystem services and been able to integrate it into the way that they do business. And then for many of these specific services, over the course of the day, we'll get into a fair amount more detail. So arguably the most famous ecosystem service project is the water supply for New York City. It's a rain-fed surface water system. A majority of the watershed is in forest or agriculture, and the 15 million people or whatever it might be in New York City, we're looking at a degrading water quality reality. And so they had two options. They could either spend $6 to $9 billion in new filtration to treat the water that was coming in, or they could make a $2 billion investment to enhance the ecosystem services in the watershed, improve practices on agricultural land, conservation and preservation of certain forest systems, and really thoughtful management and prioritization. And they were able to recognize about a $6 billion cost savings by investing in nature instead of just built infrastructure. And this example really spurred a lot of the efforts that you're going to hear about today. Going to a totally different part of the world, in Niger, in some of the driest parts of Africa. In the late 80s and 90s, you saw incredible famine and human suffering. Very dry landscape, and there was a major push for regreening, to invest in the ecosystem services, investments that covered nearly 5 million hectares. So that's real scale. And it was looking at soil stability, water security, food security, and livelihoods. No small feat when you think about all those different elements. And what they were able to do is dramatically regreen the system. So not only were they able to plant more trees, but where you saw the green vegetation, you also dramatically saw increases in food security and production. So those numbers on the far side of the screen are years, 0 to 3 years, 3 to 6, and 6+. And you can see where there is greater tree density, that connected with where you saw greater grain production and food security. And Niger is now sort of the case study for many other parts of Africa and other dryland areas. A lot of ecosystem service work is driven by government or by non-government organizations. But increasingly you're seeing the corporate sector, the private sector of the world, invest in ecosystem services. And as recently as 5 to 10 years ago, most companies were making those investments because it looked good. They could make fancy commercials about the investments they were making. But when they look at the world today and they see climate change, they see water risk, they're now making these investments because it enhances their bottom line, improves their revenue streams, and reduces their risks. Just this morning, I got an email from AB InBev, the maker of Budweiser, one of the finest American brews that's out there, who is interested in working with us to understand what their water risk might be and how they can mitigate that across the globe. So we developed a system to help companies understand exactly what their ecosystem services risk looks like, where they're having the greatest impacts, both positive and negative, and opportunities for them to actually make a positive contribution. And this is one of the screenshots from one of the organizations that we were working with, where we really began to map out the ecosystem services that they were dependent upon, that they were impacting, and ultimately how they could be part of the solution in contrast to being part of the problem, which was traditionally, unfortunately, the role of the corporate sector. Aquaculture. Food security is a common theme that you're going to hear throughout the day. How do you feed what will be 9 billion people on a finite set of acres in a world of a changing climate? And aquaculture has been one type of such approach. So here's an example from Honduras in Central America. So this was a healthy mangrove system about 30 years ago, and then aquaculture took off. And you can see how the map changes in terms of what the landscape looks like. And so they have a lot more seafood, but there were a lot of implications for that concerted effort there. And when a lot of people look at the economics of the aquaculture approach, they initially looked at, well, mangroves don't provide much, right? There's maybe a little bit of timber value, etc., versus look at the profits that we get from shrimp farming. And so on the surface, it's a no-brainer, right? We should be investing in aquaculture all over the world. Mangroves, they're all tangled, not that interesting. But when you start really looking at the true ecosystem services of mangroves and the true impacts of aquaculture, it paints a very different story. So if you look at the other things that mangroves provide in terms of fisheries and habitat, And then coastal protection in terms of storm surge. Mangroves are critical when major storm events come in dampening their effects and protecting communities and infrastructure along the coastline. And then you compare that with the negative, what we call externalities of shrimp farming, basically. You take away the subsidies because it's heavily subsidized by the government. And then you look at the pollution that comes from shrimp farming. And then you look even further at the cost to then restore after flood events, and all of a sudden, you know, the balance is quite shifted. We can't just manage for ecosystem services for the sake of fancy publications and reports. We've got to build it into the economic decision making, because we all know that economics is what drives long-term sustainability and management. Lending institutions. So whether it's USAID, the Dutch Development Cooperative, and others, some of the biggest ecosystem service investments are made by your multilateral entities, the UN and the like. And over the last number of years, there's been a huge push from the NGO community to ensure that those entities are very clearly thinking about and being transparent around how they deal with ecosystem services. And so there is now an IFC, which is part of the financing wing of the World Bank, some clear standards around how they have to report how their investments are considering ecosystem services and related impacts. Species habitat, water provisioning, carbon sequestration. Change starts with measurement and transparency and eventually leads to better decision making. And we're starting to see, you know, 5-8 years ago we were sort of here on that supply chain. We're now moving much further along. Just a few more examples here and then I'll wrap this up. You know, carbon markets was really sort of the big push around the theory of ecosystem services, especially around 2008. After the Kyoto Protocol was agreed upon by at least many of the European nations, not by George W. and our friends back at home. But you are now starting to see kind of a rebirth of forest carbon markets, the role of ecosystem services both in climate mitigation but also climate adaptation. I talked about thresholds before, and in many ways for climate we've passed certain thresholds and there are going to be impacts around more frequent weather events, whether it's drought or flood, tornadoes, hurricanes, etc. We've seen that in the US with Hurricane Sandy and in many other places across the world. So again, thinking about not just how we deal with today, but how we think about ecosystem services for generations to come. Bad stuff happens. It's life. And it's not always intentional, and unfortunately sometimes it is. But ecosystem services can also very clearly be built into the way that we think about providing incentives and providing smart regulations and penalties for those who damage ecosystem services. So in Belize, where coral reefs are a huge part of economic growth and ecotourism for the country, they had about 10 years ago a major incident where a huge tanker ship crashed into a key coral reef section that was pretty important for ecosystems. And WRI helped with an assessment that was able to put a value on those ecosystem services that were lost. And a judge at the national level in Belize then fined the shipping company $6 million to go towards restoration of ecosystems. The BP oil spill in the Gulf of the US, 4 years ago, led to the largest single corporate settlement in the history of the US, and that money is now going to restoration throughout the coastal area. An awful, awful situation, but if there's a silver lining, you're now seeing smart investment with some of the mitigation funds that have been put in place. And in just a little bit, you're going to hear from my colleague at the U.S. Forest Service, Nicholas Smith, to explain how the U.S. Forest Service, which manages hundreds of millions of acres across the U.S., how they're thinking about ecosystem services from a planning standpoint, from a prioritization perspective, how they're communicating these ideas to the public, and ultimately how it leads itself to local, on-the-ground management. So there are three sort of ways that ecosystem services can be applied. One is sort of building it into the economic decision making through values, through incentives, potentially through regulations as well. But to make it a scalable approach, you've got to think about how it ties to policies and regulations, long-term planning, and the like. And most importantly, it's a framework that helps you be prioritized and systematic. It helps you communicate the mission of CACAL and other such natural resource agencies, and allows people to provide valuable feedback for an adaptive management approach. And if you look at some of the examples that I provided, you can see sort of which of those three components each of the case studies really accentuated or were critical for their implementation into decision making. And again, I'm happy to make these slides available for anyone who wants to look at these in more detail. Just going to skip that one. So my last two slides are just kind of some core takeaways and synthesis of some of the points that I'm making, which you'll hear more about through many of the presentations, both some of the US experts, but also some of our Israeli counterparts as well. And if you think, and I think CACAL is a really good example, Chanukana gave us a great field tour yesterday and described very clearly how, up until recently, it was a very timber-oriented, single resource focus for the Forest Service, where now there's a greater focus on being multi-resource focused, recreation, fire management, connection to the land. And ecosystem services really helps because it forces you to sort of list out everything and prioritize. It helps you really tie a science-based approach into management and decision making. And helps you consider trade-offs, because there are winners and losers, whether it's wildlife versus water, fire versus recreation, ecology versus economics. Trade-offs doesn't always mean bad, but they are real, and it's important to consider and continue to evaluate over time to see if that balance still makes sense in the years to come. And then my last set of takeaways really focuses on transparency and communication. In the places where the idea of ecosystem services has been most successful, it's where it has been more than just an idea that is developed in a back office. It is something that is continually shared and debated and reprioritized with a broad spectrum of stakeholders from across the different sectors of the economy, the corporate sector, the government sector, nonprofit, thinking about the economy, the ecology, and the social realities. Figure out what that vision truly is and why. Communicate that. Don't be afraid to elicit feedback, and don't be afraid to admit that things change over time, and therefore your plans and your implementation needs to follow that same reality. So with that, again, I'm honored to be here today, and if you do know of any lovely Jewish women, my grandmother would be thrilled if you help me out with that. So, Todah Rabah, and thank you so much.